Hey everyone, in this video I'll show you how I made this farmhouse style coffee table. So the first thing I did was to mill up all the lumber that I used. I used 3 2x4s. So first I used my planer as an edge jointer, and then I used the planer to surface plane both sides of all of the 2x4s. Next, I cross-cut all of the 2x4s to length, and if you'd like to make this table for yourself, you can check out the description for a length of all the cuts I made as well as all the tools that I used in this video. The previous cuts gave me all the pieces I need for the side frames, and these longer boards I ripped directly in half to make up the bottom and the top apron of the table. Next, I cut another 2x4 to length. I ripped these sections again similarly to the others. These boards would make the X of each side of the table. Here's a freeze frame of all the pieces laid out. Again, check the description out if you want the dimensions and the length of each board cut. Next, I put pocket holes on each piece of the top and bottom side frames. These pocket holes would allow me to use screws to connect them to the legs. If you're in the market for a pocket hole jig, I highly recommend the K4 Craig jig. It works very well, allows you to make pocket holes very easily. After I drilled all the pocket holes, I laid the pieces out for the side frame, used my square to ensure everything lined up perfectly, and then I used glue and screws to assemble the frame pieces together. The top piece of the frame will set flush with the legs, and then I used a scrap 2x4 on the bottom to leave some relief. So with the legs clamped across the side frames, I used screws to attach everything together. After the first frame was completed, I made a second frame using the same process that would mirror the first frame exactly. To connect the side frames together, I used the aprons that I cut earlier. I drilled pocket holes on each side of these using the K4 Craig jig. I then secured the apron pieces in place using glue and screws. This can be a little tricky to get everything exactly in place. You can use clamps here to help, but I found that the screws will help tighten everything up if you go slowly and hold everything firmly in place. So after I connect the second apron, you can start to see that all the pieces come together to actually look like the frame of a coffee table. To get the X pieces measured and cut right, rather than try to measure angles, I set the table overlapping each piece of the X frame and then trace the overlap. One thing I've learned is to either mark or number each corner, that way you won't get the pieces mixed up when trying to put them back in place. With each piece marked, I then use my miter saw to cut the angles off of each. Once the corners are cut off, each piece can be put back in place, and then similarly to how I cut the angles off earlier, I trace the overlap of the center to cut a half lap join out from each X piece so that they would set flush in the middle. I cut the half lap join out of the center using my miter saw, and I set the depth gauge halfway through so that half of the piece would be cut out and they would overlap flush and set perfectly with each other. This footage here is sped up a lot. This is not a place to get in a hurry, so take your time if you're using the miter saw to cut out the half lap joints for these. Once the half lap joints were cut out of the center of each, I glued them in place, put them together, and then they could be put in place on the side of each end of the table. So I put a little bit of glue in each corner and then just popped the X into place by tapping on each corner until it fit equally on each side. Next, I drilled into each side apron, which would allow me to attach the X to the apron using screws. I repeated this process for the X on the other side, and then it was secured in place using glue and screws as well. I made the bottom shelf out of slats, which I cut from a scrap 1x4 that I just had laying around. So I ripped it to the appropriate width and then I cross cut to the length. Again, check the description if you want the dimensions of the slats and all the pieces in this project. So I equally spaced the slats out the best I could, kind of just looking at them without measuring, and then I attached them to the bottom apron using brad nails. Here's a quick look at the frame fully assembled, and then it was time to stain the table. I used Minwax Early American wood stain for this, and since I planned to paint over the stain, I really wasn't concerned about getting all that great of a stain job. This basically just serves as a base coat which will show up for when the paint is distressed. That said, you do want to make sure that all of the surfaces are covered with the stain so that there won't be any bare wood after the distressing occurs. I let the stain dry for about 2 days and then I painted over it using my paint sprayer. I'm using a HomeRite Super Finish Max here. So I planned on distressing the paint with a sander after it was dry. I'm not sure if the stain was still wet and bled through, but the stain on the wood grain eventually came through somehow. I didn't distress it at all, so the paint finish at the end photos accidentally happened by itself. I thought it looked awesome though, so I left it as it was. For the top, I used 1x6" boards. Apparently I forgot to record this part, but I started with 2 8-foot boards and just cut both of them to length. I then stained each side and all the edges with Minwax Early American stain. Normally in most of my videos you'll see me join the tabletop boards together first, but I really wanted to keep this build simple, so I just left the boards individually and attached them separate. So I first clamped across the top of all the boards to keep them together tight, and then I clamped each joint to the actual frame of the table so that I could attach it with screws. I pre-drilled through the frame to prevent any splitting on each end, and then use screws to attach the top to the frame, going under through the frame into the top boards. It is worth mentioning that screws will restrict wood movement. However, I felt like I could get away with this on this top since the top boards are thinner and not as wide across. If you feel like wood movement is more of an issue, you could always use Z-clips, tabletop fasteners, or expansion brackets to attach the top. So I used 3 screws to attach the side apron to the top, and then I flipped the table over and repeated the process of attaching the other side frame and top apron to the tabletop. I pulled the clamps off and then the table was finished. I normally finish the top with a polyurethane or polyacrylic, but I wanted a completely flat finish, so I left it as it was. Here's a final look and some pictures of the finished table. I think it turned out great and this was a really fun build. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, as each will really help my channel out. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned for more.